The flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. "Ma'am, you need to move. This is first class." Sarah's eyes snapped open. The woman in the crisp uniform stood over her, arms crossed. Her name tag read Jessica. Her smile was plastic. "I'm sorry?" Sarah blinked, still groggy from her nap. "Your ticket says 22B, that's economy. Way back there." Jessica pointed toward the rear of the plane with obvious disdain. "Stick till the end. At 80% there's a reveal you won't see coming. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories like this." Sarah looked at her boarding pass. "Row seat A," she held it up. "No, see? 8A, right here." Jessica snatched the pass. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against the paper. She studied it like it might bite her. "This has to be a mistake." Jessica's voice rose. Other passengers turned to stare. "Someone like you doesn't fly first class. Someone like you." The words hit Sarah like ice water. Sarah was 28. She wore faded jeans and a simple sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. No makeup. No jewelry except a plain silver watch. Her backpack was old and worn at the edges. She looked exactly like what she was, a small-town girl flying alone. "The ticket is valid," Sarah said quietly. "I paid for it." Jessica's laugh was sharp. "Right, and I'm the Queen of England." The man in 8B cleared his throat. He wore a $1,000 suit and gold cufflinks. "Is there a problem here?" "Nothing I can't handle, Mr. Morrison," Jessica said, her tone suddenly sweet. "Just removing someone from the wrong seat." Mr. Morrison looked Sarah up and down. His lip curled slightly. "I see." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd dealt with this before. The assumptions. The judgments. People saw her clothes, her age, her quiet manner, and decided she didn't belong. "Please," Sarah said, "just check with the gate agent. Or your computer. The seat is mine." "Listen, honey," Jessica leaned down, her voice patronizing. "I don't know how you got that boarding pass. Maybe you found it. Maybe someone gave it to you as a joke. But I'm not buying it." Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. She took a slow breath. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. A technique she'd learned long ago. When stakes were high and nerves mattered. "What's your name?" Jessica demanded. "Sarah Chen." Jessica pulled out a tablet. Her fingers flew across the screen. Her confident expression faltered for just a moment. Then she frowned deeper. "Fine. The computer says you're here, but that doesn't mean you belong here." "What does that mean?" "It means mistakes happen. Computer glitches. Someone probably upgraded the wrong passenger by accident." Jessica's voice grew louder. "You should do the right thing and move to economy where you belong." Other passengers were watching now. Some looked annoyed at the disturbance. Others seemed entertained by the drama. A few pulled out phones to record. Sarah could feel their eyes on her. Judging. Assuming. She knew what they saw. A girl out of place. Someone who'd wandered where she didn't belong. If only they knew. Sarah reached into her backpack. Her fingers found a small leather folder. Inside was her pilot's license. Current and valid. Airline transport pilot certification. Multi-engine rating. Over 2,000 flight hours logged. She almost pulled it out. Almost showed Jessica exactly who she was dealing with. But she'd learned to be careful about revealing too much too soon. Instead, she closed the folder and kept it hidden. "I'm staying in my seat," Sarah said. Jessica's face flushed red. "Excuse me?" "I paid for this seat. I have a valid ticket. I'm staying. We'll see about that." Jessica spun on her heel and marched toward the front of the plane. Mr. Morrison shook his head. "You should have just moved, you know. Causing a scene won't end well for you." Sarah didn't respond. She pulled her backpack closer and closed her eyes. But sleep wouldn't come now. Her heart was beating too fast. This wasn't how she'd planned to start her trip to Los Angeles. 3 months ago, Sarah had been living in Millbrook, Kansas. Population 847, she'd been working at her uncle's crop dusting business, flying old planes over endless fields of corn and wheat. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and it kept her in the air. Then came the letter. Pacific Airways wanted to interview her for a pilot position, a major airline, based in Los Angeles. Everything she'd dreamed of since she was 12 years old. The interview was tomorrow morning. Sarah had saved for months to afford the flight. First class had been a splurge, a way to arrive relaxed and ready. Instead, she was dealing with this. Jessica returned with backup. A tall man in a captain's uniform followed her down the aisle. 4 stripes on his shoulders, silver hair, stern expression. "I'm Captain Walsh," he said. "What seems to be the problem?" Jessica launched into her story. She made Sarah sound like a criminal, someone who'd snuck aboard with a fake ticket, a troublemaker who refused to follow rules. Captain Walsh listened without expression. When Jessica finished, he turned to Sarah. "May I see your boarding pass?" Sarah handed it over. Walsh studied it carefully. He looked at his tablet, then back at the pass. "The seat assignment is correct," he said finally. Jessica's mouth fell open. "But Captain, the passenger has a valid ticket for seat 8A. That's where she belongs." Sarah felt a small surge of relief. Finally, someone with sense. But Captain Walsh wasn't finished. "However," he said, looking directly at Sarah, "I understand there's been some confusion about your presence here. In the interest of avoiding further disruption, perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy. We could arrange a partial refund for the fare difference." Sarah stared at him. "Are you asking me to move because of the color of my skin?" "Of course not," Walsh said quickly. "I'm simply suggesting that I don't belong in first class." "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." The cabin had gone completely quiet. Even the flight attendants in the back had stopped their preparations to listen. Sarah stood up slowly. She was only 5'4", but something in her posture made her seem taller. "More dangerous, I have a valid ticket," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the cabin. "I paid full price for this seat. I haven't broken any rules or caused any problems. The only disruption here is the assumption that someone like me doesn't belong." Captain Walsh's face reddened. "Miss, I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly." Sarah reached into her backpack again. This time she pulled out a small black case. Inside was a pilot's headset. Professional grade. Expensive. Well worn from years of use. She held it up so everyone could see. "I'm flying to Los Angeles for a job interview," she said, "with Pacific Airways. They want me to be their pilot." Jessica laughed. Actually laughed out loud. "You, a pilot? Right, and I'm an astronaut." "Believe what you want," Sarah said. She sat back down and put her headset on the armrest where everyone could see it. "But this conversation is over." Captain Walsh looked uncertain now. Professional pilots were a small community. If Sarah was telling the truth, if she really had an interview with Pacific Airways, this could become a very expensive problem for his airline. But Jessica wasn't backing down. "Anyone can buy a headset," she said loudly. "That doesn't make you a pilot any more than buying a stethoscope makes you a doctor." A few passengers murmured agreement. Sarah was young. She looked more like a college student than an airline pilot. The headset could be a prop, a way to make her story seem credible. Sarah closed her eyes and took another deep breath. She could end this right now. Show them her license, her logbook, the letter from Pacific Airways. Prove exactly who she was and watch their faces change. But something held her back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe it was the memory of every time someone had told her she didn't belong somewhere because of how she looked or where she came from. "Captain Walsh," Jessica said, pressing her advantage, "we can't have passengers lying about their credentials. What if she's mentally unstable? What if this is some kind of elaborate scheme?" Walsh nodded slowly. "Miss Chen, I'm going to have to ask you to provide some proof of your claim. If you can't, I'll have to ask you to deplane." "Proof of what?" "That you're actually a pilot." Sarah opened her eyes. The entire first-class cabin was staring at her, waiting. Some looked skeptical. Others seemed hopeful, like they wanted her story to be true. She thought about the little girl who used to lie on her back in cornfields, watching planes cross the sky. The teenager who worked 3 jobs to pay for flying lessons. The woman who'd earned every rating and certification through sheer determination, all leading to this moment. "Fine," Sarah said quietly. "You want proof?" But before she could reach for her license, the plane lurched violently to the left. Passengers screamed. Drinks flew through the air. Sarah's headset clattered to the floor. The aircraft shuddered and dropped. Not a gentle descent, a sickening fall that pressed everyone into their seats. Emergency lights flickered on. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, and from the cockpit came a sound that made everyone's blood run cold, the pilot's voice over the intercom. Panicked, desperate. "This is Captain Walsh. We have an emergency. I repeat, we have an emergency. Is there a doctor on board? Is there a pilot on board? We need immediate assistance in the cockpit." Sarah looked around the cabin. Passengers were screaming, praying, crying. Jessica had gone white as a sheet. Mr. Morrison was gripping his armrests so hard his knuckles showed bone. Captain Walsh's voice came again, more urgent this time. Please, if there's anyone with aviation experience, we need you now. My first officer has collapsed. I can't handle this alone. Sarah stood up calmly. She picked up her headset and clipped it to her belt. Every eye in first class was on her now. Jessica found her voice first. You can't be serious. You're not actually going up there. Sarah looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not vindictive. Just quiet confidence mixed with something that looked almost like pity. Still think I'm lying about being a pilot? She started walking toward the cockpit. Behind her, the first-class cabin erupted in chaos. Sarah reached the cockpit door just as another violent shudder rocked the plane. The door was locked. Standard security protocol, Captain Walsh, she called out, knocking hard. It's Sarah Chen, you asked for a pilot. Go away. Jessica's voice came from behind her. The flight attendant had followed, along with half the first-class passengers. This is insane. She's not qualified for this. The cockpit door cracked open. Captain Walsh's face appeared. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His eyes were wild with panic. Are you really a pilot? He asked Sarah. ATP license, multi-engine rating, 2,000 hours. Walsh hesitated. Sarah could see past him into the cockpit. The first officer was slumped over the controls, unconscious. Warning lights flashed red across the instrument panel. The plane was flying itself on autopilot, but barely. She's lying, Jessica insisted. She's just some kid with a fake headset. Walsh looked between them. His hand trembled on the door handle. Another alarm started blaring. Sharp. Urgent. Captain? Sarah said quietly. What's your emergency? Engine failure on the right side. Hydraulic problems. And my first officer had some kind of medical episode. He just collapsed. Sarah nodded. She'd trained for this exact scenario. Not in a real emergency, but close enough. Any passengers with medical training helping the first officer? A nurse from economy is with him now. But I need someone who can help me fly this plane. I can do that. Jessica grabbed Sarah's arm. Stop this charade. People could die because of your lies. Sarah turned to face her. The young woman who'd been humiliated and dismissed was gone. In her place stood someone else. Someone with steel in her voice and ice in her veins. People will die if I don't help, Sarah said. Let me do my job. She pulled free from Jessica's grip and stepped toward the cockpit. But Walsh still blocked the door. I need to see credentials, he said. I can't let just anyone. The plane dropped again. This time worse. Passengers screamed. Someone was crying in the back of the cabin. Sarah reached into her backpack and pulled out her license folder. She flipped it open and showed Walsh her ATP certificate. His eyes widened. Sarah Chen, Pacific Airways interview candidate. You know about that? We all know about it. Pacific poached you from crop dusting in Kansas. Made quite a stir in the pilot community. Jessica peered over Walsh's shoulder at the license. Her face went from pale to green, but she's so young, Jessica whispered. Age doesn't matter in an emergency, Walsh said. He stepped aside. Get in here. Sarah entered the cockpit and immediately assessed the situation. The first officer was breathing but unconscious. A passenger who looked like a nurse was checking his pulse. The right engine was shut down, its indicators dark. Multiple warning lights painted the instrument panel in angry reds and oranges. But the most important thing was still working. The autopilot was keeping them in the air. What's our altitude? Sarah asked, sliding into the jump seat behind the pilots. 37,000 feet. We've lost about 2,000 since the engine went out. Fuel? Enough for maybe 90 minutes. Less if we have to circle. Sarah put on her headset and immediately felt more centered. The familiar weight. The clear communication. This was her element. What about airports? Where's the nearest suitable runway? Denver International is about 40 minutes out. But I don't know if I can get us there alone. The hydraulics are making the controls heavy. Really heavy. Sarah studied the instruments. Engine 2 was completely dead. Engine 1 was working but showing stress indicators. The hydraulic pressure was low but not critical yet. She'd seen worse in the simulator. But simulators didn't have 200 real people on board. Captain, I can help you get this plane down safely. Walsh looked at her with desperate hope. You're sure? I'm sure. Behind them in the cabin, Sarah could hear Jessica trying to manage the panicking passengers. Her voice was shaky, but she was doing her job. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We have a qualified pilot assisting the captain. Someone shouted back, she's just a kid. How do we know she's really a pilot? Because I checked her license myself, Jessica said quietly. Sarah almost smiled at that. Almost. Okay, Walsh said. What do you recommend? First, let's get clearance for Denver. Then we need to start a gradual descent, save fuel and reduce stress on the remaining engine. Sarah reached for the radio controls, then stopped herself. This wasn't her plane. Walsh was still the captain. With your permission, sir? Walsh nodded. Take it. Sarah keyed the microphone. Denver Center, this is United Flight 447. We have an emergency. Requesting immediate clearance to Denver International. Direct routing. The controller's voice came back crisp and professional. United 447 understood. You're cleared direct to Denver. Descend and maintain flight level 350. State nature of emergency. We have an engine failure, partial hydraulic loss, and an incapacitated crew member. We'll need emergency equipment standing by. Roger 447, emergency equipment will be ready. Souls on board and fuel remaining? Sarah looked at Walsh. 212 passengers, 12 crew, he said. Fuel for about 70 minutes. She relayed the information to Denver Center. The controller came back immediately. 47, you're cleared to descend at pilot's discretion. We're clearing all traffic out of your way. How many qualified pilots do you have on board? Sarah hesitated. This was the moment. The question that would define everything that came next. Denver Center, we have the captain and one additional qualified pilot. Additional pilot, what are your qualifications? Sarah took a breath. ATP-rated multi-engine current, 2,000 hours total time. A pause. Then, Roger 447, you're in good hands. Continue descent when ready. Walsh was staring at her. 2,000 hours? That's it? Sarah felt her stomach drop. Is that a problem? Most airline pilots have 5,000 hours minimum when they're hired. 10,000 or more for captain. I know, but 2,000 hours includes a lot of challenging flying. Crop dusting, low altitude, variable weather, emergency procedures. Emergency procedures in a Cessna, not a Boeing 737. Sarah's confidence wavered for the first time. He was right. Her experience was mostly in small planes, single-engine aircraft that weighed less than 1% of what they were flying now. But she was here, and she was all they had. Captain, I may not have airline experience, but I know how to fly, and right now you need help. Walsh nodded slowly. You're right. Let's do this. They began their descent toward Denver. Sarah monitored the instruments while Walsh handled the controls. The plane was heavy and sluggish with one engine out, but it was responding. For 20 minutes, everything went smoothly. They lost altitude gradually. The remaining engine held steady. Passengers had calmed down somewhat after Jessica announced they were safely diverting to Denver. Sarah even started to relax. That was when the second emergency hit. A new alarm. Different tone. Sarah's blood turned to ice when she saw which warning light was flashing. Fire warning. Engine number 1, Captain, she said quietly. We have a fire indication on the remaining engine. Walsh saw it too. His face went white. No. This can't be happening. Sarah's training kicked in. We need to shut it down before the fire spreads. If we shut down the last engine, we become a glider. A 200,000-pound glider. If we don't shut it down, we could have an explosion. Walsh's hand shook on the controls. Sarah could see him falling apart. The stress, the responsibility, the impossible choices. He was freezing up, Captain, Sarah said firmly. You need to decide now. But Walsh just stared at the instruments, paralyzed. The fire warning kept blaring. Getting louder. More urgent. Sarah looked out the window. They were still 15,000 feet above the ground. Denver was still 20 minutes away. Without engine power, they might not make it. But with an engine fire, they definitely wouldn't. Sarah reached for the engine fire handle. What are you doing? Walsh grabbed her wrist. My job. She pulled the handle. Engine number 1 shut down immediately. The fire warning stopped. And suddenly they were flying a very expensive, very heavy glider. The only sound in the cockpit was the whistle of air over the wings and the quiet hum of the backup electrical systems. We're not going to make Denver, Walsh said quietly. Sarah was already scanning for alternatives. Her eyes found the GPS display. She traced their glide path, calculating distance and altitude. There, she pointed to a small airport symbol on the screen. Centennial Airport. It's closer. That's a small field. Short runway, no emergency equipment. It's our only option. Walsh keyed the microphone with shaking hands. Denver Center United 447. We've shut down our remaining engine due to fire indication. We're not going to make Denver International. Requesting vectors to Centennial Airport. The controller's voice was tight with stress. 447, understand you've lost both engines? Affirmative. We're a glider now. Roger, turn left heading 240. Centennial Airport is 12 miles. Runway 10 left is the longest, 5,500 feet. Sarah did quick math in her head. A Boeing 737 normally needed at least 6,000 feet of runway to land safely. They were about to attempt it with 5,500 feet, and no engines for a go-around if they messed up the approach. Captain, Sarah said, I need to take the controls. Walsh looked at her like she'd lost her mind. What? You're shaking. You're stressed. I can see it. And I have more experience with short runway operations. You're talking about crop dusting strips. This is a commercial airliner. Physics is physics. Weight and speed and glide ratios. I can do this. Walsh hesitated. Outside the cockpit windows, the ground was getting closer. They were running out of altitude and options, Captain, Sarah said quietly. Trust me. For a long moment, Walsh just stared at her. This young woman who'd been sleeping in row 8 when this all started. Who'd been dismissed and humiliated by his own crew, who might be their only chance of survival. He let go of the controls. Your aircraft, he said. Sarah took the yoke in her hands and felt the heavy weight of the powerless plane. No engine thrust to help, no hydraulic boost to make the controls light. Just 200,000 pounds of metal and 200 people trusting her to get them down safely. She looked at the approach to Centennial Airport. It would require a steep descent and precise speed control. Too fast and they'd overshoot the runway. Too slow and they'd stall and crash short. The margin for error was 0. United 447, you're cleared to land any runway Centennial Airport, came the radio call. Emergency equipment is rolling. Sarah acknowledged and began the steepest approach of her life. In the cabin behind them, passengers had figured out something was very wrong. The engines were silent. The plane was descending quickly. Some were crying, others praying. Jessica's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're making an emergency landing at a small airport. Please ensure your seatbelts are tight and review the safety card. Our pilot has everything under control. Our pilot, not the captain. Our pilot. Sarah smiled grimly and concentrated on the approach. The runway appeared ahead. It looked impossibly short from this angle, like trying to land on a postage stamp. Airspeed 160, Walsh called out, reading the instruments. Too fast. Sarah pulled the nose up slightly to bleed off speed. 150. Better. But the runway was coming up fast. 140. The ground rushed toward them. Sarah could see cars on the highway below, people looking up at the powerless airliner. 130. Perfect approach speed. But were they going to make the runway? The airplane crossed the runway threshold at 50 feet. Then 30. Then 20. Sarah pulled back on the yoke and felt the main landing gear touch down. They were on the ground, but moving very, very fast, and the end of the runway was coming up quickly. Brakes, brakes, Walsh called. Sarah stood on the brake pedals with all her strength. The plane slowed, but not quickly enough. The runway end markers flashed past the windows. They ran off the end of the runway into the grass, still moving at 30 miles per hour. But they were down. They were safe. The plane finally came to a stop in a field of prairie grass. Engines silent, everyone alive for a moment. The cockpit was completely quiet except for the sound of Sarah's breathing. Then Walsh started laughing. Not hysterical laughter. Pure relief, you did it, he said. You actually did it. Sarah unbuckled her harness with shaking hands. The adrenaline was wearing off now, replaced by the magnitude of what had just happened. Behind them, they could hear passengers cheering and crying with relief. But then came a sound that made Sarah's heart sink, shouting from the cabin. Angry voices. She could have killed us all. How do we know she's even qualified? This is exactly what happens when airlines hire pilots who aren't ready. Sarah closed her eyes. Even after saving everyone on board, some people still couldn't accept that someone like her belonged in that cockpit. But then other voices joined in. She saved our lives. The captain couldn't do it alone. She's a hero. Jessica's voice came over the intercom one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, we are safely on the ground thanks to the skill and courage of our flight crew. Everyone please remain seated while emergency personnel assist us. Sarah started to stand up, but Walsh put a hand on her shoulder. Wait, he said. Before we go back there and deal with all of this, I want you to know something. What? In 30 years of flying, I've never seen anything like what you just did. That approach, that landing, it was perfect. You didn't just save those passengers, you saved me too. Sarah felt tears she didn't know were there start to well up in her eyes. Thank you, Captain. No, Walsh said firmly. Thank you. And one more thing, yeah? When you interview with Pacific Airways tomorrow, you make sure to tell them about today. Because any airline would be lucky to have you. Sarah nodded and finally stood up. It was time to face the passengers, time to deal with the aftermath of the most challenging flight of her life. But as she walked toward the cabin, she knew something had changed forever. She was no longer the girl who didn't belong in first class. She was the pilot who had brought them all home, safe. Sarah stepped into the cabin and was met with complete silence. 200 passengers stared at her, some with gratitude, some with disbelief, a few still with suspicion, but they were all alive. That was what mattered. Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. Paramedics were boarding to check on the unconscious first officer and anyone else who might need medical attention. Jessica stood near the front of first class. Her perfect uniform was wrinkled. Her makeup was smudged. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the last hour. When she saw Sarah, her face crumpled. I'm so sorry, Jessica whispered.
You were doing your job, Sarah said quietly.
Following procedures. No, I was being judgmental and cruel. Jessica's voice broke. I could have cost everyone their lives because of my assumptions. Mr. Morrison, the man in the expensive suit who'd been sitting in 8B, stood up slowly. His arrogant expression was gone. In its place was something Sarah had never seen from him before. Respect, Miss Chen, he said formally. I owe you an apology. And my life. You don't owe me anything. I do. We all do. He turned to address the cabin. This woman saved us, all of us, and I'm ashamed of how she was treated. Other passengers began to stand, one by one. Then in groups they started clapping. It began as scattered applause from a few people. Then more joined in. Within seconds the entire cabin was on their feet, clapping and cheering. Sarah felt her cheeks burn. She'd never been comfortable with attention. But this felt different. This felt earned. A young mother from economy class pushed forward with her daughter, maybe 8 years old. Thank you, the woman said, tears streaming down her face. Thank you for bringing us home to our family. The little girl looked up at Sarah with wide eyes. Are you really a pilot? Sarah knelt down to the girl's level. I am. That's so cool. I want to be a pilot too. Then work hard in school, study math and science, and never let anyone tell you that you can't do something because of who you are. The girl nodded seriously, then hugged Sarah tight. As the passengers began to deplane, Sarah stayed behind to help with the post-incident procedures. The FAA would want statements. There would be investigations, paperwork, but Captain Walsh handled most of it. He made sure everyone knew exactly what Sarah had done, how she'd saved not just the passengers but him too. Without her, he told the investigators, we'd have crashed. No question. 2 hours later, Sarah finally walked down the jet bridge into Centennial Airport's tiny terminal. She was exhausted, emotionally drained. Her interview with Pacific Airways was in 12 hours, and she hadn't even reached Los Angeles yet. But as she entered the terminal, she stopped short. There was a crowd waiting for her, passengers from the flight, airport employees, local news crews. The story had already broken. Social media was buzzing with videos taken inside the cabin. A reporter thrust a microphone in her face. Miss Chen, how does it feel to be a hero? I'm not a hero, Sarah said automatically. I'm just a pilot who did her job. But you saved 200 lives. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her. She saw Jessica standing near the back of the crowd, still looking ashamed. Mr. Morrison talking to another reporter, praising Sarah's skill. The little girl who wanted to be a pilot, watching everything with fascination. Anyone with proper training could have done what I did, Sarah said. The real lesson here isn't about heroics. It's about not judging people by their appearance or making assumptions about what they can do. Another reporter called out, What's next for you? Sarah smiled for the first time all day. I have a job interview tomorrow. With Pacific Airways. The crowd laughed and clapped again. As the news crews finished their interviews and the crowd began to disperse, Jessica approached Sarah one more time. I need you to know, Jessica said. I've requested to speak to my supervisor about my behavior today. What I did was wrong. Discrimination, plain and simple. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Because if I don't learn from this, I'll do it again to someone else, and they might not be as strong as you are. Sarah studied the flight attendant's face. She saw genuine remorse there. Real understanding of what had happened. We all make mistakes, Sarah said. What matters is what we do afterward. Jessica nodded. If you ever fly our airline again, and you're ever on one of my flights, I promise you'll be treated with the respect you deserve. I'd like that. An hour later, Sarah was finally on another plane to Los Angeles. This time, no one questioned her first-class ticket. The captain even came back to introduce himself and thank her personally. The flight was smooth and uneventful, exactly how flights were supposed to be. Sarah dozed off somewhere over Nevada, her head resting against the window. She dreamed of flying, not of emergencies or engine failures, just the simple joy of being in the air, free and unbound. She woke as they were descending into Los Angeles. The interview the next morning went better than Sarah could have hoped. The Pacific Airways executives had already heard about the emergency landing. They'd seen the news coverage. Read the captain's report. We'd like to offer you a position, the chief pilot said. First officer, Boeing 737, based here in Los Angeles. Sarah accepted immediately. 6 months later, she was flying regular routes for Pacific Airways. San Francisco to Denver, Los Angeles to Phoenix. The job she'd dreamed of since childhood. She thought often about that day at 37,000 feet. About the assumptions people made. About how quickly everything could change. But mostly she thought about the little girl who wanted to be a pilot. Sarah had started volunteering at schools, talking to kids about aviation. Especially girls. Especially kids from small towns who might think their dreams were too big. She always told them the same thing. Work hard, study, and never let anyone tell you that you don't belong somewhere because of who you are or where you come from. One day, Sarah was deadheading on a flight from Denver to Chicago, sitting in first class wearing her captain's uniform now, 4 stripes on her shoulders. A young flight attendant was working the cabin, new, nervous, trying hard to impress. Sarah watched as the attendant approached a teenage passenger. A young black man wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans. He was sitting in first class looking uncomfortable. Excuse me, the flight attendant said politely. Could I see your boarding pass? Sarah tensed. She'd seen this before. The teenager showed his pass. First class, legitimate. But the flight attendant frowned. This seems unusual. Are you sure you're in the right seat? Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Is there a problem here? She asked, her captain's authority clear in her voice. The flight attendant looked flustered. Oh, Captain Chen, I thought maybe. You thought what? The young man looked mortified. It's okay, he said quietly. I can move to economy. I don't want any trouble. No, Sarah said firmly. You paid for that seat. That's where you belong. She looked directly at the flight attendant. This passenger has a valid ticket. There's no problem here except the one we're creating with our assumptions. The flight attendant's face went red. You're right. I'm sorry. Both of you. That was wrong of me. The teenager settled back into his seat, relief visible on his face. Sarah sat back down, but not before catching the young man's eye. What's your name? She asked. Marcus. Well, Marcus, I hope you have a pleasant flight. And remember, you belong wherever your ticket says you belong. He smiled. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Sarah reflected on how far she'd come. From the crop-dusting fields of Kansas to the captain's seat of a commercial airliner. But more importantly, she thought about the ripple effects. The lives changed by that one emergency landing. Jessica had become one of the airline's most inclusive flight attendants, mentoring new crew members about unconscious bias. Mr. Morrison had started a scholarship fund for aspiring female pilots from rural communities. The little girl who'd hugged Sarah that day? She was now taking flying lessons, determined to follow in Sarah's footsteps. And Sarah had learned the most important lesson of all. Never judge people by what you see on the surface. You never know who might be sitting in row 8, ready to save your life. As they began their descent into Chicago, Sarah looked out at the city lights below. Thousands of people living their lives, each with their own dreams, their own struggles, their own hidden talents waiting to be discovered. Tomorrow she'd fly another route, meet more passengers, maybe encounter more assumptions and prejudices, but she'd also have more opportunities to show that excellence comes in all forms, that heroes don't always look like what we expect, that sometimes the person who can save everyone is the one others think doesn't belong. The plane touched down smoothly at O'Hare, another successful flight, another group of passengers delivered safely to their destination. As Sarah gathered her things and prepared to deplane, she noticed Marcus getting up from his first-class seat. "Captain Chen," he said as she passed. "Thank you. For earlier, I mean. Just doing my job." "No," he said quietly. "You were doing more than that. You were showing me that I belong. Just like someone probably showed you once." Sarah smiled. "Someone did. And now it's my turn to pass it on." She walked off the plane and through the terminal, her rolling bag clicking on the polished floor. Behind her, Marcus watched her go. A young man inspired, a future pilot perhaps, another life changed by the simple act of standing up for what's right. The ripples spread outward, one flight at a time, one person at a time, one moment of courage at a time. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply recognize that everyone deserves respect, regardless of how they look or where they come from. And sometimes the person sitting in row 8 might just be the one who saves you all. If this story made you feel something, subscribe for more true heart stories that challenge assumptions and celebrate the heroes hiding in plain sight. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you witnessed someone being judged unfairly? Your voice matters, and your story could inspire someone else to stand up for what's right.